here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live on CGTN from Beijing. I'm Tian Wei. China is working on enacting the national security legislation for Hong Kong. As a related decision was adopted at the national legislature, the deputies to the 13th National People's Congress voted overwhelmingly to approve the decision. Various local groups in Hong Kong have launched a movement to support the security legislation. The law's backers said it will improve the region's long-term stability. However, over in Washington, U.S. President Donald Trump announced he was moving to end Hong Kong's special status with the U.S., at least apparently.
Therefore, I am directing my administration to begin the process of eliminating policy exemptions that give Hong Kong different and special treatment. My announcement today will affect the full range of agreements we have with Hong Kong, from our extradition treaty to our export controls on dual-use technologies and more, with few exceptions.
Of course, he said a lot of things about how to punish Hong Kong, including visa restrictions and other actions may follow, and also in separate moves against China. He announced a ban on Chinese postgraduate students believed to have ties to China's military while conducting research at U.S. university. In response, China warned of countermeasures to any foreign interference in Hong Kong affairs, with this message coming for Washington.
The decision of the National People's Congress of China to establish and improve the legal system and enforcement mechanism for the maintenance of national security in the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region is entirely China's internal affairs. No foreign country has the right to interfere. We will take the necessary countermeasures to resolutely oppose the wrong actions of external forces interfering in Hong Kong affairs. Hong Kong is an important area for the investment and operations of American industry and commerce. Washington has important interests in Hong Kong. We advise that the U.S. recognize the situation and stop interfering in Hong Kong affairs, China's internal affairs. If the U.S. insists on harming China's interests, China will take the necessary measures to resolutely fight back.
So, what is Hong Kong's special status with the U.S. that made U.S. President Donald Trump keep on talking? And what challenges face Hong Kong when the status is revoked? However, what are some of the opportunities that could lie over there as well? Let me loop in our panelists in Hong Kong, our Xie chairman and CEO of Gaofeng Advisory Company. In New York via Zoom, a little bit dark there. We have Anthony Chen, former J.P. Morgan Chase chief economist. And in Beijing, Liu Baocheng, Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics from University of International Business and Economics based in Beijing. Now, let me ask all of you by talking about the economics and also about trade at this time. So, Mr. Xie, tell me more about the general reaction now in Hong Kong after the national legislature adopted the decision to work on the legislator.
Well, of course, you have different factions in Hong Kong. Some of them are against the new law, and some are very supportive of the new law. I can say, as a Hong Kong person myself, I was born and raised in Hong Kong, and been working here since I returned from the U.S. I say that I hugely support this law because for over a year, with the anti-extradition bill and all the riots and the unrest that has been caused because of that, and also all the other activities like subversion activities in Hong Kong, that has really made Hong Kong very unstable and, in fact, almost ungovernable. So, as a person myself, a Hong Kong person myself, I'd look forward to this law.
Mr. Xie, let's talk about the economics, and that is the purpose of this discussion, because the politics have been handled in many of the various programs already here on CGTN. So let's talk about the economics. When the U.S. president threatened to take away the quote-unquote special status of Hong Kong regarding its relation with the United States in terms of trade and economics, what does it really mean for Hong Kong from your perspective? Briefly, if you can, for an introduction answer.
Well, he wasn't very specific when he spoke about that on Friday, and he mentioned things like trade and sort of technology and so on. So I don't know exactly what he has in mind. My guess is he probably doesn't have much in mind when he was talking about it. So I would leave it just at that to make it very brief, and I can comment later if you have further questions.
Let me go to you, Mr. Chan. You're joining us from New York. I hope people there are safe, both from the pandemic and certainly from the latest events. But let me ask you this time about Hong Kong, Mr. Chan. How should we understand the banks, particularly the American banks, financial institutions that are pretty much concentrating in Hong Kong in terms of their outreach in Asia, particularly to China's mainland? Will they think about moving as the president threatens?
I think that right now such actions are premature. I think that the president was not specific, as you heard on Friday, about what actions he's going to take, that they're going to take place. Remember that this year, Hong Kong, like the rest of the world, is suffering, like we are in New York City, from this pandemic, and the economy in Hong Kong will probably contract this year anywhere from 6 to 6.5%. And that is a sharp decline from the prior year when the economy contracted by about 1.2%. So I think that the United States has to be very careful when they make these steps, because if you go ahead and act too aggressively with Hong Kong, you actually end up causing more damage to the overall economy in Hong Kong. And I don't think anybody wants to see that. So that may be one of the reasons why there were no real specific as to what actions that were going to take place. So my hope is that this is a lot of noise, but at the end of the day, the actions won't be as detrimental to the Hong Kong economy as one might have expected after hearing those initial remarks from the president.
I have a number on hand. Total assets, U.S. banks in Hong Kong around 148 billion. Well, customer deposits was about 79 billion US dollar, representing about 5% of Hong Kong's total banking sector. That's the latest number I got on hand. There might be some updates, but that was the idea. So, Mr. Xie, listening to those numbers, are they significant if decisions are being made by American banks or financial institutions to move away over a long process to other parts of Asia or other parts of the world? Would that very much have an impact on Hong Kong's financial sector, or being the so-called the Oriental Pearl, which a lot has to do with the financial services?
Well, the numbers are significant, as you just mentioned. However, the picture is not a static picture. As you also know, right now, actually, because of some of the issues in the U.S., increasingly Chinese companies are coming to Hong Kong and get second listing or seek the primary listing here in Hong Kong. So this position of Hong Kong as a financial sector is actually being strengthened with without this sort of intervention from the U.S. administration. So I think the entire picture is a very dynamic picture. Right now, the U.S. bank's representation is quite significant, but over time, the other banks or other sources of financial representation can increase. I also have to say that of the American clients that I talk to, and I have quite a number of them here in Hong Kong, about how they feel about this situation here, none of them have told me, as of now, they have any plan of leaving Hong Kong. At worst, they would say, well, let's see. But nobody said, well, you know, this is so bad that we're going to leave Hong Kong. Nobody have told me about that.
There are a lot of talks and a lot of rhetorics coming from politicians. Professor Liu, tell me more about your thoughts listening to your colleagues.
Well, I think in the first place, whether the sovereign supremacy is really there to prevail. So you know, that really runs seemingly into confrontation with what Donald Trump has been proposing. So The other issue is that, okay, it seems to be the very cost-effective measures for Donald Trump to raise his voice over Hong Kong, pointing to human rights issue, pointing to the threat to the Hong Kong's autonomous issue, in order to bring more popular votes, because a lot of people do not even know what is
but
going
you know,
there
my
in Hong
question
Kong.
really, sir, is more about the economics. We have a lot of political debates, all the reason being already lined out through 24 hours of CGTN programming. Let's focus on the economics. This is really the matter, actually. So, Professor Liu, as an economics professor or trade professor, do you have any intake on that?
Yes. So Hong Kong as the financial hub and also as the shipping hub is really evolving in the globalization process, and it is still playing a very important role. But there is disaffection among a number of groups that are, by Chinese central government supporting Shenzhen or Shanghai, etc. That put Hong Kong into a rivalry position. But in the meantime, we do see that they still serve as the hub for a number of multinational regional headquarters. And right now, the impact is not really immediate, and they are still watching, because how China is going to launch this law and how China is going to implement this law, that's still premature. And in the meantime, whether Trump is simply there throwing rhetorics, or is he going to produce a slew of harsh measures over Hong Kong, so that's still uncertain.
But
so
you know,
businesses won't really...
That's really the point, isn't it?
Right.
I mean, you can see the strategies of President Trump. He has a strategy that is that he tried to throw hard things, or these hard words out first, and then try to diminish the courage from the other side, and therefore try to win as much as possible from his perspective. But you know, the question really is whether it's not about whether China will have a watered-down version of the national security law, but rather about, you know, what will be the real impact of economics if the other side is taking actions. I think that is the key here. Once these numbers are worked out, I think both sides and all of us will understand what's the real nature of this, whether this really matters or not. Having said that, though, talking about numbers, let me read some for all of you gentlemen. The Hong Kong government notes recently that over the past decade, the U.S. has become the country with the highest trade surplus in Hong Kong among its global trading partners. Between 2009 and 2018, the trade surplus surpassed $290 billion US. Although Hong Kong's imports and exports have grown steadily, Hong Kong is also a large hub for re-exports. In 2019, approximately $508 billion US in goods were re-exported, taking up to almost 99% of its total exports. So a lot of numbers there. Mainly the meaning is U.S. biggest trading partner of Hong Kong in terms of exports to Hong Kong. And also Hong Kong is a hub for re-exports. Almost 99% of those exported into Hong Kong already going out to the other parts of China or other parts of the world. So now, every share. Tell me more about what these numbers mean.
The numbers means that actually the U.S. is in a major trade surplus with Hong Kong, and therefore, if you know, the U.S. would like to increase the tariffs, you can tell by the numbers, right? Most of the Hong Kong so-called exports to U.S. is actually re-export, and those re-exports are mostly from mainland China to the U.S. And so you would actually know that, or guess that, you know, if there's any tariff increase that's been caused already by the U.S.-China trade war, that has been affected anyways. So the real exports from Hong Kong per se to the U.S. is actually a very tiny portion. So if the U.S. administration said, well, you know, let me increase your tariffs from whatever percent to some bigger percentage, the impact to Hong Kong as a whole wouldn't be that significant from that standpoint.
Interesting. Mr. Chen, you have a take on that?
Yeah, that's exactly correct. We can increase the tariffs to Hong Kong as much as we can, but the tariffs are from the originating country, and that's mostly mainland China and other countries. So it's not going to have that much of an impact. So I think that at the end of the day, everybody knows that it's in the best interest of the United States for the Hong Kong economy to do better. And by the way, it's in the best interest of China for Hong Kong to do better. China certainly has ambitions to create that greater Bay Area, which is going to include Hong Kong. So they really have the best economic interests of Hong Kong in mind. Outside of the political situation that I think is leading to this confrontation, everybody has to step back and realize that both parties want Hong Kong to do better. And when we take that into account, we realize that taking a deep breath and certainly not rushing to judgment is the best economic strategy that both China and the United States can adopt.
At this point, Professor Liu, during the pandemic, economies have realized that there have to be two ecosystems for a country like China. And I guess maybe for an economy like the United States, you have two ecosystems. One is the ecosystem of trade that you have within your country, because the borders sometimes can be dangerous to open up from time to time, depending on the virus. That's one ecosystem. The other ecosystem is international trade ecosystem that we used to have. Of course, now there are a lot of disturbances as a result of unilateralism and things like that, but still it exists. So how is China, since you're coming here from Beijing, looking at these two ecosystems and the threats coming from Washington, the elections going on? You know, how does all of these pictures work together or against each other?
You're very right. I think from China's perspective, on top of that, China also views whether it's a temporary landscape or whether it's a long-term landscape. So over the pandemics, yes, there is definitely the rhetorics, there are definitely the physical restriction over the free movement of all factors of production, be it in technology, be it physical goods and services, right, etc. But this is really an event that cannot really blindfold people's view over a long-term picture where
so what about Hong Kong in this regard?
Where a global supply chain is still the fundamental to support the globalization process and support the realization of the economic value of innovation. So Hong Kong plays still a very important role. It's evolving. It's no longer a manufacturing hub, but it's still serving as a financial hub. It is also a terminal to connect the global financial marketplace versus mainland China and also the rest of the Asian region. So that picture does not really change. And also that China is also increasingly reliant on the re-export of Hong Kong, given a number of uncertainties from Europe, from North America, etc. So the Hong Kong's prosperity and Hong Kong's stability is really fundamental, either for global supply chain through the new division of labor and realization of innovation, and also for mainland China.
Okay. Let me ask you, Mr. Xie, about some of the points the other two guests just mentioned. One is about technology. Hong Kong aspires to play a role in terms of innovation. Now, that process is a bit delayed by the recent events over the past year or two. Will a threat coming from Washington cutting off Hong Kong's access to new technology and scientific development really going to hinder Hong Kong's future of coming in as a new kid on the block in terms of science and tech industries?
Well, again, you know, the details are not come out yet, but presumably the U.S. administration would do something along this line. I think the impact will be some, but not going to be significant. As you said correctly, you know, it looks like we are now developing two ecosystems in the world in terms of technology, a China-centric and a U.S.-centric. But even with all these restrictions that the U.S. is now putting on the Chinese companies, like Huawei and all the other companies on the negative list, China is finding its own ways to develop its own technologies, albeit more difficult, more challenging, but China is on its own way, finding its own ways. I think Hong Kong will find its own way as well, even if the U.S. decided to exercise whatever control or limitation they want to apply to Hong Kong.
Interesting. Mr. Chan, what about Hong Kong dollar, U.S. dollar? Now, Hong Kong, one of its best qualities, at least seen from the mainland, for example, is about its free access to the U.S. dollar and the exchange rate. What about that? Will that change?
Well, certainly a lot of people are going to be worried about whether the peg can be maintained. But Hong Kong has a pretty big war chest of $4.3 trillion of foreign exchange reserves. So I think for the moment, that is not a real issue that we should be all concerned about. What we really should be concerned about is that we can get through this process and realize that even though we are in fact creating two different worlds in terms of technology improvement, economics tells us that in order to actually make progress and raise everyone's standard of living, and that is for the United States and for China, is to really pursue the theory of comparative advantage. And that is that countries should be working together, not against each other, because when you work against each other, both countries lose.
Exactly. We hope some of those in Washington that are listening to your voice and your opinions. You know, gentlemen, as Hong Kong's Chief Executive Carrie Lam welcomed the NPC, meaning the National People's Congress, China's top legislature's decision on the national security legislation, Lam says she will work with the standing committee of the NPC to complete the legislation as soon as possible. She also signed a petition supporting the legislation. Take a listen.
All this has jeopardized the security of the country and the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. I want you all to remember that national security is everyone's responsibility. We should fully support it.
Meanwhile, political advisors from Hong Kong have issued a statement expressing support for the proposed new security legislation. By the way, these numbers are actually CPPCC members and also NPC deputies, meaning they are top advisors for China, and also they are members of China's top legislature. They say without security, there can be no prosperity and stability in Hong Kong. They also say it is now essential for the central government to address the serious threat of Hong Kong's security and the lack of security legislation. And they call on the general public in Hong Kong to support the legislation. Of course, there are also different opinions going on in Hong Kong. We saw earlier some of the demonstrations in Hong Kong suggesting they would rather not to have a legislation like this. We'll see how the debate going, particularly the process of the standing committee of the NPC, how it is coming out with this law and how it is working with the Hong Kong SAR government to have the best version of it. Having said that, though, we are almost running out of time. Gentlemen, before we go, I do want your advice about how to proceed to observe Hong Kong from now on. We saw so many international media press coverage of one sort or another, a lot of rhetorical wars in social media. What is the best way, do you think, to look at Hong Kong? Mr. Chan.
I think the best way to look at it is to see what this law really is telling you. It's telling you that it doesn't want subversion, it doesn't want treason, it doesn't want people disrupting the government in China or Hong Kong.
Okay.
And those stipulations themselves are not unreasonable at all. The question is, we should take a deep breath and start to think about whether there can be trust between China, the U.S., and Hong Kong.
Well, of course, Hong Kong is part of China. That is already in the basic law and the Chinese constitution. Let me go to you, Mr. Xie. Your final words, briefly, please.
Yeah, the NPC has just approved the framework or the structure of the new law. There's still a lot of details that need to be worked out in between the NPC and also the Hong Kong government. I think the way to look into this going forward in the next few months is looking at the details of how the whole thing is going to be designed, and whether or not this is aligned with the interests of all parties.
Okay. Mr. Liu, Professor Liu, final words.
I think now control is not really the final objective, but it's really how we can really build confidence with the global community through communication, negotiation, or how we can really win trust from the bigger majority of the Hong Kong people into what is really lying in the future is more of promise than really control.
Okay. Communication is the key, whether it is within China, which Hong Kong is part of it, or with the international community. Thank you so much for the three of you for joining us. Edward Xie, Anthony Chen, Liu Baocheng. Appreciate it. Thank you, gentlemen.